All right, so starting over here, we're going to talk about data privacy today. So I'm on the legal team at Atlassian, and just to prove to you that I'm a lawyer, I'm going to start with a disclaimer. So this presentation is not legal advice. What does that mean, right? Well, it's kind of a lawyer trick. You change one word and it means something different. But this presentation is legal information. Right? What's the difference between legal advice and legal information? Legal information is general to your area or your industry. We're going to talk about the trends that are happening in the developer world. We're going to talk about how this relates to tech. What we're not going to do is we're not going to talk about your specific situation as a company. That would be legal advice. If you have questions about your specific sort of concerns or circumstances, what your app does, you're welcome to talk to me about this. I'll be here for about an hour afterwards, and then through the rest of Summit, you can ping me on the app. But ultimately, you need to get a lawyer to talk about those kind of things for real legal advice. I'll do my best to sort of pinch it in the meantime. So what we are going to talk about today is we're going to cover a lot. So this presentation is 40 minutes. Probably not going to leave any time for Q&A, but we can do that outside afterwards because there's a lot that's been going on this past year. And my goal is for everybody to leave here feeling like they're conversant in this topic, mostly that it's no longer scary, if it scares you, that we reduce any panic, and that you feel like you have a good hold on what you need to focus on for your business, what is strategically important, and some good tips coming out of here, and resources on where to find more information. So we're going to kick off by covering the global trends in the past year in data privacy. Then we're going to kind of unpack those themes, right? Because there's a lot of headlines and a lot of sense to make of these things. Then we're going to talk about changes to Atlassian's platform, so how we thought about these things vis-a-vis the tools that you use on our platform. And then we're going to talk about what you should do when you develop your app, the things that you should be thinking about. So a lot of ground to cover. Again, if you leave 20% of this, that's sort of met our goal of washing over and getting sort of a first wave of this. There'll be materials available for you on the developer Atlassian.com site. Okay, so in order to understand where we are sort of in the conversation of data privacy, it's important to understand where we've been. So for a lot of people, data privacy is sort of snuck up on everybody, caught the world by storm, and it's sort of like, why are we talking about this? Well, in order to understand that, appreciate it, I think we need to go back to 2006, about the time that data privacy, or about the time that cloud computing became mainstream. This picture displays the countries that had data privacy legislation on the books at that time. Surface area is kind of predictable. This does not speak to how well developed the laws were, how much they were sort of thinking about technology, but it gives you a sense of the countries that were sort of thought leaders in this space. As we fast forward to today, these are the countries that have data privacy legislation on the books. Now, that is not to say that they're all consistent. That's also not to say that they're all equally enforced. And I think in the past year, everybody's familiar with the fact that the EU really led the charge in this area, right? So they elevated the existing laws that they had on the books, and they realized they weren't really impacting the industry in the way that they wanted to. Shortly thereafter, just lest we think that that was a blip on the radar, we saw a number of countries, and in the case of the United States, follow the footsteps of GDPR and pass GDPR-like legislation. So we're going to look at those trends a little bit more today. The main takeaway is this is a global trend. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, and so investing in understanding how this relates to you is an investment in your business. Okay, so just to underscore this just a little bit more of where we've been versus where we are today, 2012, there was this sentiment of like, why are we talking about data privacy? It's not anything that anybody really cares about. This quote is often misattributed to Mark Zuckerberg, so you can take that fun fact out of here today. But it was made by an equally important executive in an equally important technology company. And in response to a group of journalists that asked him what his viewpoint was on data privacy, he said, well, you have zero privacy anyway, so just get over it. So if that wasn't a proclamation that privacy was effectively dead, then in 2018 was the zombie apocalypse of privacy, right? So privacy like reached its withering hand through the grave and came back for every single tech company from here forward. So we're going to take a look at what that looked at like in the past year. The past year, data privacy really shaped the landscape of technology. If we start sort of in the calendar year of data privacy, which is May 25th, 2018, forever here on forward, that's the date that GDPR went into effect. We start in May. GDPR goes into effect, and the world effectively chokes on privacy, right? So like everyone scrambles to get their consent and their notice and transparency and put all these principles into place. And we didn't end up with like a very good result, right? But we're moving in the right direction. June, California, lest anybody think that the EU is going to be the sole mover in this space, joins by passing GDPR-like legislation, effectively putting fear into every social media company in the United States. These laws will go into effect in 2020. This also kicked off the discussion of US federal privacy legislation, which we're going to get into in just a second. July, we saw Facebook's largest stock drop in its history due to the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So probably most everyone in this room is familiar with that, but that was where Facebook was passing data to its third-party developers, who in turn sold that data to researchers that purportedly influenced the election of Donald Trump. August, Brazil and India joined the EU and California in passing GDPR-like legislation. September, US tech companies are called before the US Congress to testify on privacy. This is actually a good thing because we finally moved, at least in US government, past the sort of like, what is the internet conversations. So we have the right people talking to each other, albeit reluctantly. October, Facebook has their first fine for the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Now, $650,000 is not a lot for Facebook. The point of this was it was a shot across the bow by UK regulators. They couldn't fine them under the new fine or penalty regime under GDPR because you can't retroactively fine for acts before the law was changed. The idea here was the UK commissioner was saying, in the future, this fine is going to have several more zeros behind it. November, we saw Canada join the GDPR-like crowd, passing legislation that would go into effect then. Oh, let's go back here. December, Google announced major changes to its public APIs, right? So for your world, this means that we saw the first sort of movement towards, we're no longer just kind of generally make data available through our APIs. We're going to allow the user to have choice over that and then respect that choice all the way through how we pass that to our developer community. January, Google gets hit with a $50 million GDPR fine, which was the largest fine to date under GDPR, 50 million euros for violations of their data sharing arrangements. February, we start to see the United States draft federal privacy legislation. This was something that categorically was dismissed as never going to happen by our current sitting president a year ago, and here we are talking about federal privacy legislation in the US. These hearings and these debates are going on right now. Next, we saw Facebook under criminal investigation for sharing data with partners. This was a new curveball for the tech industry. If the prosecutors have their way in this case, which was just brought in the month of March, there will be business executives going to jail from Facebook. And lastly, not to be outdone by the EU, the Federal Trade Commission approaches Facebook for violations of its consent decree, among other things, and proposes a multi-billion-dollar settlement, which Facebook is in the middle of, which makes Google's $50 million euro fine look like quite the steal. Okay, so enough doom and gloom, but that's sort of the year in review for data privacy. So what does that mean for you guys, right? Like, what does that mean that I leave tech and I find a new job? Seems too risky to operate in. It doesn't. But I want to help you kind of make sense of the themes of where data privacy is heading. Now, one of the things to be mindful of is the idea of protecting personal data is not new, but we've just put a lot more horsepower behind it. And where you are and where you operate and who your customers are is going to shape how the laws are enforced. So for example, Atlassian has a large EU and US customer base. So we think a lot about the data protection laws that are on the books there. In the EU, they're very human rights focused. If any of you are from the EU, you will know that privacy is a fundamental human right in the EU. This is contrasted with, for example, the US regimes, right, which are much more consumer focused. We're a consumer society. We're all about how much money is made. And so the US laws are all about taking money back from the technology providers and putting it into the hands of the consumer. Whereas the EU laws are more of giving them a right of redress, right, that sort of reestablishes dignity and rights to the data that they have. The US regime is more like, we're going to give you a private right of action so that you can sue someone. Finally, China, Russia, Iran actually have very similar laws when you read them on the face. they would never be used to protect the individual or to give the individual money back. They would only be used to further national sovereignty interests. So it's important to understand that when you're looking at where these laws are enforced, because it shapes how you're going to think about the data and where you put it and what kind of problems you're solving for. But the main takeaway is that these laws are a global trend. They have consistent themes, though, right? So I'm not saying that you need to go out and read every single one of these laws and understand them. That is unrealistic and really boring. But mostly, you can unpack these themes into major categories, and you can understand quite broadly kind of what your best practices should be. All of these laws do the same thing. They blow out the definition of personal data, right? So we're no longer in this negotiation of like, well, is it my social security number? Do I really care about my healthcare information? One of the congressional representatives was cross-examining the CEO of Equifax and asked him to recite his social security number, his name, his home address, his email address, or any level of that information that he would feel comfortable sharing. His name was the only thing that he was comfortable sharing because it was already on public record at the time. But the point was, Equifax's whole defense was that the data that was breached in their security incident didn't cause any harm, right? But his reluctance to share that information in a congressional hearing was because he thought it might harm him, right? Like he didn't want to share it with other people and have them use it against him. So this is where we've taken the judgment out of service providers and we put it in the hands of the individual. Whether or not you think somebody's IP address is important, whether or not you think their email address is important, the individual gets to decide in this scenario. There's also this theme that individuals generally get more control. Right, so in each of these laws, you will see the same themes of you should be able to tell an individual at any time what data that you hold on them. You should be able to allow them to modify or change that data, particularly where it impacts them materially, say for example in like health benefits. You should be able to delete them, which is something that we didn't really think about beforehand, right? Because data was cheap to store, the cost of storage was going down even more. It was sort of one of those problems that we didn't take the time to solve. And then lastly, you should be able to give them some choice around how their data is used. All of these laws increase the penalties, whether through monetary fines, criminal penalties, civil penalties. And finally, all of these laws seek to really up-level what data is, which is a global commodity, right? So this idea that like as a government, I only get to regulate data within the boundaries of my geography is no longer realistic or sort of consistent with how data works. We used to see a real like gaming of the system in this case, right? Like where you'd see Google or Facebook setting up shop in Ireland because other data protection commissioners couldn't regulate those companies beyond their boundaries or beyond their borders. And Ireland was generally considered to be a more favorable data protection authority. That loophole has effectively been closed. And so now if there is data from any specific EU resident traveling elsewhere, it's fair game for one of those regulators to come after you. Okay, so with all those themes unpacked, now we had to think about how does this apply to Atlassian? Data privacy legislation is hard because it's meant to cover categorically an entire industry. And we don't sit in the same space as fintech or healthcare tech or even social media in some cases. And so you really have to take the pieces of this legislation that matter to our industry and our space and how our customers think and what they expect and bake that into our practices. So here's how we did that. When we thought about the biggest problems and the biggest focal points, we looked at the fact that data sharing is a focal point right now, right? So the idea of like a sort of like monolith service provider doesn't really exist in today's world anymore. And so regulators are more and more interested in, okay, you get this data from your customer, but how are you sharing it? Who are you sharing it with? Under what circumstances? And this was really the fact that the regulators kind of awoke to the fact that platforms are porous and they have integrations and there's ways that that data can be shared that's often imperceptible to the individual. So regulators have really taken the position of policing that and asking the questions on behalf of individuals and consumers. Next, the theme that we've come across is transparency is not enough. So that first slide that I showed where it was all the cookie consent banners that you saw kind of post GDPR, it's no longer enough to tell consumers and customers what you're doing with it. You actually have to think about what they would expect and choices proactively for them. So we've moved past a world of okay, I'm going to throw up this screen that tells you, here's all the data I'm going to use on you, and you're signing over all your rights, and cool, everybody feels really good about that conversation, right, because I told you about it. That no longer exists. And that was actually the world that we lived in for quite a while. Which brings us to our next point, which is developers and service providers are expected to design privacy into their applications. And that's a new thing, right? Because it's not really sometimes entirely functional to the app. But this is where we really have to step into the shoes of our customers and think about across the multiple use cases that they may be traveling across our integrated products and services, what expectation do they have of how we use their data? And that often is challenging if we're coming from a specifically cultural point of view. If you're in the US, you may just be awakening to sort of the privacy sensitivities. In the EU, you're probably a little bit more sensitive to that. So it's important to be mindful of the biases that we carry into that conversation. Okay, so what does this look like for platform and developer? Platform side, this looks like you will start seeing from us more programmatic controls. And when I say that, that sounds really scary. Like programmatic controls sounds very legalese and not a good thing for everybody involved, right? This is really just making sure that we're having an open dialogue with you. So one of the things that came up in the Cambridge Analytica scandal was Alexander Kogan, who was the developer, was really kind of hung out to dry in that scenario, right? And his feedback was, Facebook's defense was, well, this was in our terms. He should have known better because we said you're not supposed to sell data, you're not supposed to share it. But it was buried in a wall of text that was really written by lawyers for lawyers. And his comment was, hey, if I knew that what I was doing was against Facebook's terms or that it wasn't kosher within their environment, I would never have done it because I had built my entire existence on their platform. If they had just come to me and had a conversation or told me why what I was designing wasn't appropriate or didn't meet their expectations, I would have happily changed that. So that's what the programmatic controls are about. On your side, we're asking you to limit the use of data. Now, many of you already do this, but this is simply the idea that if your app provides specific functionality that is relevant to, say, a Jira platform, that user doesn't expect that you're consuming their data to then also share it with a third party or sell it with a third party who's not providing that service. On the platform side, we're also investing in technical controls. Where we can take some of the guesswork out for you and you don't have to guess, am I navigating in the right space? Am I not? Am I doing this right? That we can actually make those decisions for you or put that control back in the hands of users. We're going to talk about this a little bit in the recent API changes. And I encourage you to attend Alex Kassab's talk later today, which will talk about building in sort of this new technical controls framework. On your side, you're going to limit the scope of data that you call to that which you absolutely need. So kind of gone are the days of, well, let's just grab everything and then we'll figure out whether or not we need it later. That's no longer sort of allowed under the regime. Lastly is education and awareness. So this is a journey that we're on. It's part of this talk today. But we can also do better about giving you some self-service tools about how to operate your business sort of in this new normal. So we're going to be working really hard over the next year. We already have done some of this to publish guidelines, point you to resources, help you understand what are easy win best practices that you can abide by that just give you a lot more confidence in expanding your business and your platform. And lastly, we're going to ask you to comply with our terms. Right? So this isn't the most fun part of everything, but you should read our terms. You should understand if you're a developer what the developer terms say, what your contract with the API is. If you're listing, you should read the marketplace vendor terms. We have an open forum for this. We're happy to answer questions. Sometimes we're not as timely as we would like to be, but this is something where we want to make sure that you get clarity on what it is that you're signing up for when you do business with Atlassian. And finally, a lot of this feels sort of overwhelming. It's like, gosh, there's a lot of moving pieces to keep track of. I would say I think we all have a head start in this room because really a lot of this is about filtering your choices through the value set of don't fuck the customer, right? So when we think about our customers who also have to comply with data privacy laws, our customers that don't want to have to worry about managing various points of data and really want to trust that the data is being extended in the right ways, this is what that's about. When I think about the way that data privacy is moving, users and customers don't actually want more choice. They don't want to have more inflection points where they have to click a radio button and do these things. And when they do, they want to be able to trust that this is a really important choice that I'm having to make. And it's something that we've thought through and we said, we can't make this choice for you. We need to push it to you. Not, we're going to push this choice to you because we think there's a chance that you'll ignore it and say yes, and then we get access to more of your data. So that's kind of the way to think about these designs, is always putting yourself in the shoes of your customer. What would they expect? In terms of platform changes, I'm going to do these high level because there's going to be a talk later today, Alex's talk, that will go through what these more specific changes, but how we thought about these conceptually. So when we looked at our platform, we, as Atlassian, said, in light of these changes, in light of sort of this new lens that we're looking at our customer expectations through, we're not doing enough. We're not doing enough to make our customers' lives easier. So we've now moved, in terms of user objects, to a global account ID. This is our Atlassian account ID. It's being used consistently across products. It will help us deliver a consistent experience to our users, and it will also help us manage data centrally. There's one user object that relates to multiple choices for the user and is updated and handled from a central place. So that means that we've given choice to the user about how they appear across our platform. Now, for some of our customers, this will be not a really important choice. Like, they're happy to be highly open and collaborative. For other customers, they use our Atlassian account across multiple products in multiple scenarios, and they're going to want the confidence that when they choose not to share, for example, their email address or maybe their picture on a community site, that it won't be indexed and publicly searchable by Google. So we're going to allow users to make these choices at a central place and have them give them the confidence that those choices travel with their data through our systems. Next, we've given users and admins a collective view of what third-party apps they've installed. Right? This kind of seems common sense, but we actually didn't have a collective view for customers to be able to understand what has been installed on my instance. What data do those apps have access to? Can I have some sort of view and control around those things? And lastly, we've given the ability for users to actually remove their data from our platform if they so choose. So if somebody wants to delete their Atlassian account, they can do that from within the product. There's no calls to support or emails or anything like that. It's done with one click of a button. OK, so that's what we've done on our end. So what should you do in terms of building your app, and how should you think about this? Well, if there's one thing that I can ask for everybody in this room to leave with today, it's a worldview shift or a mindset that when you build an app and you are collecting data through that app, it is the customer's data. It's not yours. And it has a life cycle. So when you design your app, you naturally have to think about the life cycle of that data. All the way from when the customer gives the data to you, is it clear what the expectations of that relationship is and what you're going to do with their data? Have you provided meaningful choice that they can exercise during the course of your relationship? And if they choose to leave your app, uninstalling it or deleting their account, can you give that data back to them? So those are things that I think, just from a mind shift standpoint, we all need to lean into a little bit more. Next is, you have a direct relationship with app users. They are your customers and they are our customers. So this is a collective responsibility. Just to demonstrate this, you have your end user customers here. Our products become a conduit for passing that data, and then it lands with the app. So it is true that Atlassian also has access to and responsibility for data that passes through our products, but ultimately you also have data that lands with you, and therefore you have a direct relationship with that customer. I've borrowed a screenshot from Adaptivist here for Script Runner, just to kind of highlight this a little bit more. Most of you are familiar with this, but you have a direct relationship because you actually enter into a contract with your customer, and this is where it happens, right? This is the exchange that says, here's the data that's going to be shared. Here's the consent that the customer is giving to share that data, giving Atlassian permission to send it outside of our platform, and there's the terms that you're going to do this by. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I don't think this is like the best place for us to end up. I hope we evolve past this in terms of data privacy and how we do these transactions. But this is where we are today. This is industry standard sort of best practices. I think you'll see an evolution where there will be less of these click-through, sort of click-screen scenarios. How the market moves in response to that is to be determined. But I will be the first to say I don't love this model. But this is how it works today. So in terms of you guys and developing apps, what are the best practices? So we're going to break this down into building an app. So for some of you in here, you are going to build apps, but you never plan to list them. Or maybe you're going to build them and see how it goes and maybe list them. Others of you are coming with the specific intent to list an app. So we're going to talk about building an app and then listing an app and some of the best practices. Now, this is where I contemplated pausing so we could all sort of do like a deep breathing meditation exercise, and then I could, in a soft voice explain, don't panic. This is not the stuff to panic over. This does not mean you look at these best practices and then you rush out and you're like, oh my gosh, like which developers can I pull off of whatever projects and make them our data inventory expert? That is not the purpose here. And we're going to talk a little bit about the regulatory patterns and why you really don't need to bring a fire alarm. But these are the things that I want you to take away as, oh, this is the pieces of the data privacy puzzle that apply to me as a developer. These are the things that I need to start thinking about how do I incorporate them into the functions of my business, and over the next year, build those practices out. So that's the cadence here. Okay, so building an app. How do you think about data? Well, first, do you need it? Does the functionality of your app such that you actually need to collect that data? Data is a liability, and so if you don't actually need it, and you can figure out a way to deliver the service that you're providing without it, you save yourself a lot of headache. So what I tell our developers, if in doubt, leave it out, right? So if you're not sure if it's absolutely needed for the service, don't call it. Next is, if you are going to call it, and we've done some of this work for you already, can you use an object that is dynamic, right? In other words, you don't have to worry about updating that later because it's going to naturally respect whatever the choices and sort of the real-time expectations of the user are. And finally, if you are calling it, it should be because you need to use it. And that use case is specific and current, right? So this idea that oh, we might have a use case where I don't know, just grab it and then we'll figure out how to analyze it later. We used to do that as well. And so I'm not saying that that isn't a mindset that is within the software community, but that is no longer a luxury that we have. Data integrity. This means when you collect the data, how are you ensuring that it's always true? To date. Data represents people, and therefore it can change. So think about, what is the data source? Once you land the data, where did you get it from? And is the user making central choices about that upstream that you need to think about whether or not you're reflecting that downstream? Next, can the source be changed or deleted or updated? If the answer is yes, then you probably want to think about how are you going to be able to reflect that, whatever that you're collecting. Alex will talk about this a little bit later, but this is the big push that we had to a global account identifier, so that all of those choices and changes, the life cycle of the data, were passed on to you naturally if you're storing account ID. Finally, use limitation. So once you have the data, how are you ensuring that you are using it appropriately? And can you prove that if you had to be audited, for example? So is the data needed to run the service? If yes, fair game, right? Yeah, I need it for support, I need it for security, I need it to provide this feature of the service, fair game. Even if it's not strictly needed to run the service, you may have still an okay, it may be okay for you to collect that data because maybe it benefits the user, right? Either in terms of personalizing their service or perhaps providing analytics that's going to improve the service more generally for other users. You can also consent, right? So for those of you who push your users to an email form or even an events page where you're collecting information, you're doing that on the basis of consent, right? Marketing to your users to provide the service, but it is something that you can obtain their consent to do after the fact. And finally, use is proven by access, okay? So what I tell our teams is when I have auditors come in, the only way for me to prove that you are using the data, if you are a team that isn't supposed to be seeing that data, is for me to demonstrate that you don't have access to it. So as you construct these databases, and I understand in most agile environments, it's appropriate and easier to give everyone access to everything. As you grow, think about whether your marketing team needs access to your production database. Think about whether or not certain engineers need access to customer data, raw customer data, right? Maybe your support and security team do, but don't. And so I'm speaking to a broad sort of size of companies here. Another best practice, data retention. How long are you going to keep the data? Do you have a policy for it? Don't overthink these things. There's no sort of bright line rule, as long as it's tied to a rule of reason, right? Operationally, it makes sense for us to keep it this long because here's how we generally use data. Usually there's a tail at some point. The data just is no longer valuable, and it's a quite big drop off in that curve. And you should be getting rid of it. Do you have a good reason to keep it, right? So this is just sort of that rule of reason. Could you explain to somebody why your data retention policy is 180 days or something like that? And then finally, if you are going to get rid of it, let's say after a customer terminates their relationship with you or whatever the scenario is, how are you going to destroy it? And who's responsible for that? So I encourage that because sometimes these policies get written and everyone agrees and they're like, yeah, that's a good idea, 180 days after, like, cool, okay, we got a decision. Who's going to do it? So make sure that that's actually taken care of. Data inventory. So this is just a muscle to build over time, but you should have some format for recording what you're collecting, where it's stored. So that means both in terms of, and that'll benefit you anyhow to have a data flow map to understand where is the data actually flowing through specific systems and databases. That includes your AWS platform, includes your Atlassian platform, but also geographically, where is this data going? Do you know whether or not you're sending data to servers in the US? Who are you sharing this data with? Who has access to it and how is it being used? Again, not an exercise to overthink. Have something. Something is thing. I have seen technology providers spreadsheets, and regulators have been very happy with that. So the bar is somewhat low here. The point is to get this muscle and this exercise and this awareness and this accountability going in your company. Data security. You'll want to benchmark. So this is a great forum for that. What is everybody doing? What do Atlassian's vendor guidelines say? What are some best practices there? Once you have a security standard, test it at least once a year and document that. And finally, Atlassian has published some vendor guidelines to help you with this and kind of help you understand what the best practices are there. Our security team is also more than willing to talk about these things and help you out with some of what you should and shouldn't be doing. If you're listing an app, you will notice that there is a requirement that you have a privacy policy. There are a lot of great templates online, and honestly, if you look at any service provider, their format is relatively the same. These used to be, again, contracts that were written for lawyers, by lawyers, and regulators are really asking that we move away from that. So if your sentiment here is, oh my gosh, it's a privacy policy, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know how to write that, good, because the regulators are kind of upset that lawyers are still writing them, right? They're like, this whole point is for the service provider to have a conversation with their customer and their user and tell them in real people speak what they're doing. So answer these questions. What am I doing with your data? How am I using it once I have it? Who am I sharing that with? And what are your choices vis-a-vis that? Even if the choice is, if you want to make choices, I'm not really sure what choices you want, but call me or contact me, right? Here's what you can do. This one I'm highlighting just because a lot of you operate with customers in the EU. Some of your customers may eventually ask for a data processing agreement. Don't be scared of it. And don't say you don't know what it is, because it'll look like you don't know what you're doing. Data processing agreements are required under the GDPR. They're a highly prescribed document, which is why I say don't be scared of it. There's not a lot of wiggle room or negotiation. Article 28 of the GDPR prescribes exactly what you need to say and what you need to promise. So at the end of the day, everybody's promising the same thing. And by these practices, which you have already seen. In general, it says you're going to give me access to my data. You're going to make sure that you can delete it if I need it to be deleted. It's all the things that we've already talked about. For your customers, I would recommend, if you want to and you have an attorney that you can spend some money on, putting it in your own terms, getting them to draw one up. But also, don't be afraid to your customer's DPA. If you want a good example, go look at Amazon's. It's open in publication for most people. If you use Amazon's terms, you're pretty good. I would not shy away. Very much a supply chain papering exercise. You need to be aware of it from an operational standpoint, but don't let this be the thing that sucks up a lot of time and energy in your business. And lastly, if you use third-party service providers like AWS, you will also need this in place with them, right? To the extent that you're sharing data with them. Most of them are going to offer you terms that they will graciously say are sufficient and not negotiable, and that's fine. You should just sign theirs. Okay, too much too fast. Totally understand. Do not feel like you have to walk out of this room and remember every single thing that I just said. We already have some materials on these sites. So if you take a picture of this screenshot, you can visit these later. And we will be working towards building out sort of more programmatic information that you can digest and build on in your business. Also, we welcome questions in the developer community. We will do our very best with our small team of very proficient and lean privacy experts to respond. How do I navigate this? How do I think about this? Is this a priority? Okay, lastly, I just want to leave you with a little bit of sort of a what's going on in the real world with regard to data privacy enforcement. So a lot of this gets talked about with the backdrop of the proverbial boogeyman coming, right? Like regulator or auditor, and should I be scared about that? How should I think about that? And that's why I said, take these principles. They need to be built into your business and sort of the next generation of development, but it's not something to panic over. So GDPR went into effect almost a year ago now. Any cases about the percentage in complaints and breach notifications, right? So in other words, people complaining about their data being misused or notifications to regulators about data being leaked or misused. Any guesses on the percentage increase that we've seen in the past year that regulators have received? Don't be shy. 4%? 1%. 20 times. That's not a percent. 200. Okay. So this is like, the volume that regulators have to deal with. 1,200% increase. The Irish DPA has requested a 3x increase in their budget. The Federal Trade Commission has already said, hey, we have 40 lawyers dealing with this. Okay, US Congress people, if you want to pass federal privacy legislation, we need to add a 0 behind that. So the regulatory space is catching up to the landscape that they have ordered, right? This is their design, but they're also grappling with the realities of what this means to actually enforce. The last thing that I want to do is leave you with a quote from this gentleman. His name is Michael Kaiser. He looks reasonable and nice. He is the head data protection commissioner for Germany, which is arguably one of the strictest sort of like data privacy regimes in the world. And this was him speaking recently at a conference, sort of, speaking to questions from privacy professionals, other regulators. It was post-GDPR, how's it going for you? Like, how is your office dealing with these things? Are you happy with how things are going? Are you happy with how the tech community has responded? And his response was very dry in German. And he said, it's as though everyone seems to think under the GDPR, data processing is no longer lawful. Like all of a sudden, everyone overnight was like, oh my gosh, it's illegal to touch data. And so if that's his sentiment, it sort of gives you a sense of like how he feels about some of the companies over-rotating on this. And I leave you with those two things because I say the regulatory landscape right now is really defining the legislation that they've put on the books. And they're going to do that through large industry players, like Google, like Facebook. Australia, maybe Atlassian. We hope not, because we hope we're ahead of it. But the idea is there's this real sentiment from regulators, and you see it forming in the US, that, hey, tech, you've got like 20 years of free growth. And now we really want to step in and kind of shape the way that you think about these things and do things. But that is a very long burn commitment, and it's something that's going to take a great deal of time to transform. And they're not going to do it through our developer community, right, like as a target. So I say that only to say you are being invited along this journey to up-level your business and sort of understand what the new generation of expectations from a privacy standpoint, but don't over-fixate on the headlines and the regulatory experience and auditors and all of that. Focus instead on your customers' expectations to them, understand what they care about in data, talk to us, and we'll end up in the right place with much less stress around it. That's it. Thank you very much for your time. I'll be outside for a couple minutes afterwards and look forward to talking to you all.